Scottish, and I feel rather odd speaking at a thing like this today, but I've had rather a lot to do with the sea. And well, I know what I wanted to start with. It's not exactly an ad, but inside this CD, I live by an ocean, I live with the sea in my dreams. And I do. I live at South Carcow. I live at South Carcow. When I came to Australia, I was a sound engineer. I was the head of a sound department for a television company for many years. So for about 5 years, I had a recurrent nightmare of waking up in the middle of the night and all I could hear was white noise. And then during the day, I'd meet these people go, oh, you live by the beach. It must be beautiful, that relaxing noise. And all I heard was and I thought the gear had broken down. So I've been there nearly 30 years now, so I'm used to it now. But it took me a long time to get used to the sea. I grew up in the River Clyde, and my grandfather was a shipyard worker. He was a highly skilled turner and helped make the crankshaft for the Queen Mary, the original. And I had a book at school, a history book, and there was a photograph of my grandfather working the largest lathe in Europe. So I grew up like in a shipbuilding town, and there was always ships, oceans, things like that. And later, not so much surfing, I have to say. And then later, in my 20s as a musician, I worked in the Caribbean for about 18 months on 3 different cruise ships. And so all the time, I'm just getting the growing awareness. I was always aware of the basking sharks. Once a year, the basking sharks would come up the Clyde. But after a few years, they stopped. And I think it was in the 70s, maybe the late 60s, was big news in Scotland. For the first time in more than 100 years, a salmon had been found in the waters of the River Clyde around Glasgow. And it'd been more than 100 years since there'd been any fish there, you know, and since the shipyards have all closed, the fish have come back. So that's kind of good news. I grew up in a town with more than 30% unemployment, so that's the downside of the shipyards closing. But in the Caribbean, I saw for the first time at night, and I was a stargazer, and talking of the light and everything there was very funny, because I would go out on deck at midnight, identify something, and then rush inside with all the neons and look at the star chart and go, oh, I think it's that one there, and then I'd run outside, and it would take about 20 minutes for my eyes to readjust again, and by which time I'd forgotten what I was looking at in the first place. And that was quite funny. And then you'd hear the splosh at the back of the ship, and you wonder, oh, maybe it's a fish or something, and you'd see the crew there chucking out 20, 40 black bin bags, you know. And in 1988, in my 30s, I came to Australia, and I've lived all my life at Carcow, and you couldn't really swim there a lot of the time in 1988 because there were the beach every day almost, depending on wind conditions. It was covered in little white globules of grease, the whole beach. This was meant to be this beautiful place here, and at night you could see the North Head from my house, and you could see the ocean outfall, and we were all very pleased when Palm Beach got it instead. And I think the same happened south, you know. And so my wife and I are musicians. We'd formed a band with Alister called Clarion Fracture Zone, and before we'd recorded an album or anything, we all wrote music, but Sandy especially, I think, was really, really upset. I think she just wrote more music concerned with it than the rest of us, that's all I'm saying. But we all kind of wrote music about our concern one way or the other. Alister might even have the poster of a concert. We did our first ever public pouring of music was at the Bondi Pavilion in '88, and we called it Music for the Southern Seas. And we had a poster of the fish with a gas mask on it. And I thought that was pretty good. And so things have slowly improved as times have gone on. And but we wrote music, I think what was Dollar Briffer. We stopped playing that after a while, but and we just found out all about the wonderful Sydney Harbour and all the different things that you can get there, and then the seahorses of Bob Morrell, and then and that year, it might have been 88 or 89, was the first year that anybody remembers a whale coming into the harbour. And for the first time since the Second World War, all traffic in the harbour stopped as a mother and its baby went into the harbour. They're not so fussy now, we're used to them now, they're used to us now, but that was such an unusual event that one whale had arrived with its calf, and it hung around for 2 or 3 months, I think, and it was like the Olympics when there was something magical in the water. People would be in the radio, oh, the whales are up at, you know, Newport or something, and you'd have hundreds of people just following the whales down all day, and you'd meet absolute strangers, and I don't find the Northern Beach people in general are really friendly, like they're all surfies and tradesmen and congregants, you got Mike, you know, and then suddenly all these guys have got their, have you seen the whale, have you seen the whale, it's just round the corner, oh you can't miss it, oh you can't, and it was just like something magic in the water. And I'm sure somebody here could tell me how many actual whales there are now, but is it 20,000 a year now? Something like that? There's absolutely tens of thousands. I knew a landscape gardener, and he says those whales are such a pest. I'm going, a pest? What do you mean? Oh yeah, they just annoy me. And I'm going, how on earth can a whale annoy you? What on earth has it done to you? And what it was that every time they're all digging a garden, and then somebody go, oh look, there's a whale. And all the work just stops for half an hour while everybody looks at the whale. And then once there's 20,000 of them, you know, 50 a day or something, then no work gets done, you know. And so they just annoy him. And that's quite funny. So, yeah, no, that's it. That's kind of all I wanted to say. That's my kind of connection. I loved working. I was never a diver or a snorkeler or anything like that. But it was absolutely magical, you know, to be in a cruise ship and see flying fish, and to see, you know, the first time in my life I've seen actual schools of whales. You know, you see a kilometre square of whales, but not whales, of dolphins or things like that. You know, it's, there's a lot going for the ocean, I think. But are we going to play that? So Alister and I are just going to play some music, not necessarily inspired by whales, but and then Alister will talk to you. Thanks. In case anyone's wondering, I play an instrument called an alto clarinet. That's what this is.
Mine's a pretend piano. very much. It's terrific to be included in a talk like this. My talk is very much from the point of view of, I just want to tell a little bit more about the music encounters that we had, and also my encounters with the sea. As Michelle has said already, I'm a very keen surfer, and there is a saying, I think we can probably see it. There is a saying that's out there in the surfing community that only a surfer knows the feeling. It's never really described what that feeling is, it's just, that's it. Only a surfer knows the feeling. And so I suppose I've some could say I've wasted far too much time trying to find that feeling, but I've certainly spent a lot of time at the beach over my over the course of my life. Yeah, this is a saying in a culture that I find myself in. It's a saying that has physical connotations and also spiritual connotations. It's a reflection of something that has to do not only with the act, but with the location in which the act takes place. It's an expression of something transcendent that is transmitted or infused through this particular act that takes place in the sea. When I consider that this feeling is shared by artists, carpenters, plumbers, rugby league footballers, business executives, tourists, store owners, policemen, firemen, academics, 9-year-olds and 70-year-olds, all of whom I regularly meet in the water of Maroubra, it really is a powerful statement about what the ocean offers us and what being in the ocean does to us. And I consider that the Baptist Christian notion of being reborn through immersion in water is not far off the analogy that is being described in this saying. So my early memories are of always loving the water. Being in the water offered me a sense of weightlessness, an alternative water world that my imagination could explore, a chance to let myself go physically, and a sense of achievement and conquest in this other world. I have early childhood memories of when I was 6 or so, of summer holidays at the Wamberal Lagoon on the Central Coast. My mother, Alister Spence, who was a children's book author, grew up in Erina, not far from Wamberal, so we took summer holidays there for a while, and then we moved to a beach location in Shell Harbour before the awful countryside developments took place down there, which if you've been down there recently, it doesn't look anything like it. It used to be dairy farms basically coming down to the sea. I loved being by the sea, diving under waves, allowing myself to be tumbled by the surf. At primary school there was a swimming pool and I loved being in it. At weekends in summer it was open to the public, and myself and my brother and sister would stay there as often as we could, staying as long as we could until the skin on our fingers went wrinkly and our eyes got bloodshot from the chlorine. The school encouraged swimming and life-saving skills, so I did my training in these areas, the intermediate star, and in high school I did the bronze medallion. In high school, the beginnings of my music and surfing. At high school, my interests were polarised. I was very keen about physical activities. I loved being in the gym and doing gymnastics and high jumping, and I was also keen about music and art, but not much else at school. And so I tended to pretty much kind of keep in a small group of people. We had our own little patch of turf, and we really didn't mix with very many other people, unfortunately. But I recently went to the school 40-year reunion, and that was quite a trip. So I really didn't know very many people, unfortunately. I kind of wish I'd spent more attention, taken more time to meet people at school. But anyway, halfway through my high school, one of my friends, Michael from gymnastics, who was already surfing, suggested I should give it a go. This was a big undertaking for me, as I lived in Turramurra and I didn't have my driver's licence. So a trip to the beach meant a 30-minute bus ride, followed by a 45-minute train ride, followed by a 45-minute bus ride, followed by a 30-minute walk to Freshwater Beach, all carrying a surfboard, and that was only one way. But right from the beginning, even when learning to surf felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life, there was something that this activity gave me to do with the sea and its beauty, the rhythm, the timelessness, the endlessness, the weightlessness that drew me like a magnet. At this time in surfing culture, there was an association of surfing with a creative, artistic way of life. and an integrity associated with surfing lifestyle, connected to wholeness and spirituality and well-being. A few years after I started surfing, The Morning of the Earth, which was this is a poster for, was released. This was a film that promoted these aspects of surfing culture. Of course, commercialism got in on the back of that, and now it's touted, that those same philosophies are espoused with a price tag these days, and you can buy clothes along with them as well, and surfboards and wetsuits and all sorts of things. And here's a little snippet of surfing philosophy, circa 1974. At the same time in my life, I decided to form a band with my brother Nigel and a friend who I was in art class with, Rod, and Michael, my gymnastics mate, the boy who introduced me to surfing. And so I began to find an outlet for my own music that I had started to write. My background till then had been classical piano lessons from the age of 9, which I continued until year 11 in high school, by which time I had started to invent my own music, and I became completely absorbed with that. I became besotted with contemporary music, especially British rock. I loved Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, etc. And my classical piano teacher decided she had nothing she could offer me. My early record collection traces my path pretty clearly. First album that I ever bought with my own money was Switched On Bach, which was Bach played by Walter Carlos, now Wendy Carlos, on the Moog synthesizer. My second album was Cosmos Factory by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Yeah, and my third album was Deep Purple in Rock. And then, just went on from there.
That just means you're old.
I'm admitting it, yeah, that's right. Jump forward 12 years and I was at Sydney Conservatorium studying jazz composition and performance after a fairly long period of searching to find something I really wanted to apply myself to, and a way to develop a grounded language in improvisation and contemporary harmony, which is something I felt I lacked, and so I was kind of looking for a way I guess a path that I could follow to develop skills in improvisation and composition. During this period I had pretty much given up surfing, and I focused hard on learning jazz repertoire, chaining myself to the piano for 6 hours a day in an effort to try and cram as much knowledge and technical skill in as I could. I'm still not sure whether that was actually very helpful, but that was the path I decided to take. In 1987, I had a small residency in a gig at King's Cross, and I needed to find a saxophone player, so I called Sandy Evans, and lo and behold, she accepted my engagement. 87. This was before.
We weren't here.
Well, it must have been just very early 88 then. Yes, January the 5th. All right, cool. I wasn't sure. Very good, thank you.
Exactly when I arrived.
Excellent. Though my jazz playing was just developing, by this time I had a long association with my own music and performing, and I was seeking to find people to play with who were not only wonderful players, but had integrity and artistic focus. I also hoped to associate with musicians who were interested to play their own music, and not just music from the American Songbook. I'd heard about Sandy and her band Women and Children First, and the extraordinary exploits of that group, embarking on a national road trip, including remote locations, to perform their highly individual music. I also knew that she lived by the sea in Coco, and that gave Sandy extra credibility, almost as if proximity to the sea bestowed an aura or an extra grace. Unbeknown to me, at this time, Sandy had just returned from living in Scotland, where she had met Tony Gorman. Tony and Sandy were looking to start a band, and they took a punt on me and invited me to join with them and compose alongside them, and also to sort of take a part in leading the group. And so that was the start of a group called Clarion Fracture Zone. When I found out Tony had grown up in the shipbuilding town of Greenock in Scotland, that also had a resonance with me, even though it may not have been the most pristine environment at the time. Working with Sandy and Tony right from the beginning, it was as if a whole world of possibility was opening up for me. The sort of world I had dreamt about when I used to play my own music for myself as a 16-year-old, but I didn't dare think was possible.
There you go.
The first body of work we composed and decided to present was dedicated to the sea. Music for the Southern Seas, Pieces were named with titles such as Dollibrifera, a tune dedicated to a sea slug, Feather Star, Spice Island, and La Mar Esta Inferma, the sea is ill. At that time, I think, my Spanish was very bad and I just was guessing at that. At that time, there was a concern about the amount of sewage that was being washed up on Sydney's beaches. In Maroubra, where I have surfed for the last 20 years now, the best wave on the beach was called the Dunny Bowl. Because the amount of effluent that was because of the amount of effluent that you encountered at certain times and with certain winds. This was 3 years before Sydney's deep water ocean outfall was built. Sewage outfall was built. In keeping with this focus, we decided to present our work at the Bondi Pavilion. It was quite a mammoth undertaking for a band's first major concert. We recorded, apologies for these pictures, they're not the best, but the best I could do. But, we recorded the concert very well, and thanks to Tony's connections and expertise, and from that, our first record deal with ABC Records came about. They liked our style of art so much, actually, that they pinched it for their whole series using the woodcut thing. Yes. We recorded Blue Shift, this album, in 1990. The tunes on that album were individually composed by Sandy, Tony and myself, and that became the pattern for all our albums, our 5 albums in fact, except one called What This Love Can Do, which was a suite written by Sandy Evans. And from our debut recording came an ARIA Award, lo and behold, for the first jazz album in 1990, and also a chance to tour Europe. From then on, we toured internationally once or twice a year for the next 7 years. I think I've calculated we did 7 international tours, 5 times to Europe, once to India and once to Taiwan. But we also toured in Canada and played in New York at the Knitting Factory, and really did have quite an extraordinary career for through the 90s. So, for which I am.
Our only gig in America at the Knitting Factory, they gave us a bill for $35.
Yes, it wasn't the most. It was probably the hardest gig we've ever had to do in our life to get there. And Tony actually got left at home for a little while because they thought he was a terrorist.
I wasn't left at home. I was in London.
In London.
For 3 days.
Yeah.
The Americans had my passport.
Yes. Yes, they were being very cautious about it. It was a pretty awful experience.
My worry, my home was at Coco.
Yes. Yeah. That I could be in a band with like-minded wonderful musicians playing our own music and recording and touring nationally and internationally was a dream come true for me. It was something I'd always dreamt about. I clearly, obviously, wasn't concerned about money. But Clarion Fracture Zone has been credited with being an important part of a new wave in original jazz music that occurred in Australia in the 90s. We're also one of the first bands that I knew of anywhere in the world to use sampling technology in jazz, introducing pre-recordeds in sounds into a jazz music context. So just to finish off a little bit about the sea and me. I've always been a bit of a dreamer, seeking, I quite like the idea of kind of escaping into a world other than the real one. The sea and its enormity and power and energy and beauty and the chance to play in it when the conditions are right is the perfect fit for me. As a surfer, I get as much joy from sitting out the back on my board, waiting for a wave and taking in the surroundings and watching other surfers on waves as I do from surfing itself. I know there is a trade-off by committing time to go surfing and that perhaps I don't make quite such rapid progress in my own art, but the escape valve that being in the sea offers me is a lifeline for me, and it takes me out of being in my own head too much. When I've been absent from surfing for some time, the first reconnection, the first immersion beneath the waves feels like a religious experience, a washing away, a birth into a new soul and spirit feeding.
Oh.
There you go. Me in action, look out. I think I came last that day. I usually do. But anyway, so holidays and the chance to regenerate have always been important, and the majority of these have been spent camping in a tent by the sea and surfing. I love the term recreate. I think it's a very important term and often sort of overlooked. I always take a notebook on these trips because inevitably I'll come back home from these trips with some new ideas for music. There's a couple of pieces I've recorded, a piece called Eagle Man and a piece called Mullet Run, both to do with occasions at the sea, the running of the mullet, the actual kind of swarming of the mullet would happen in the sea every couple of times every year out to the place where I go. Are two places that I've recorded and had their genesis by the sea, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. There's a saying about sailors referring to the sea as their mistress, a kind of an affair on the side. The sea definitely does have a personality for me, many different personalities actually. Sometimes the sea is a guide, sometimes a comforter, sometimes a healer, sometimes a joker, sometimes a fearsome monster, and most definitely a companion. Thank you. Yeah, so I think we might play one more piece.
One of my earliest gigs in Australia was on a Captain Cook's cruise, dinner dance on the harbour in January, it would have been. And it was one of those still nights where the rain came in, but it sort of, just a cloud sort of came down the harbour. And we were just sitting there, and I just thought, this is the best place. You want to start?
Okay. 10 piano.
I live by an ocean, I live with the sea in my dreams. And I do. I live at South Carcrow. I live at South Carcrow. When I came to Australia, I was a sound engineer. I was the head of a sound department for a television company for many years. So for about 5 years, I had a recurrent nightmare of waking up in the middle of the night and all I could hear was white noise. And then during the day, I'd meet these people go, oh, you live by the beach. It must be beautiful, that relaxing noise. And all I heard was and I thought the gear had broken down. So I've been there nearly 30 years now, so I'm used to it now, but it took me a long time to get used to the sea. I grew up in the River Clyde, and my grandfather was a shipyard worker. He was a highly skilled turner and helped make the crankshaft for the Queen Mary, the original. And I had a book at school, a history book, and there was a photograph of my grandfather working the largest lathe in Europe. So I grew up like in a shipbuilding town, and there was always ships, oceans, things like that. Later, not so much surfing, I have to say. And then later, in my 20s as a musician, I worked in the Caribbean for about 18 months on 3 different cruise ships. And so all the time I'm just getting the growing awareness. I was a stargazer, and talking of the light and everything there was very funny, because I would go out on deck at midnight, identify something, and then rush inside with all the neons and look at the star chart and go, oh, I think it's that one there, and then I'd run outside and it would take about 20 minutes for my eyes to readjust again, and by which time I'd forgotten what I was looking at in the first place. And that was quite funny. And then you'd hear the splosh at the back of the ship, and you wonder, oh, maybe it's a fish or something, and you'd see the crew there chucking out 20, 40 black bin bags, you know. And in 1988, in my 30s, I came to Australia, and I've lived all my life aware of the basking sharks. Once a year, the basking sharks would come up the Clyde. But after a few years, they stopped. And I think it was in the 70s, maybe the late 60s, was big news in Scotland. For the first time in more than 100 years, a salmon had been found in the waters of the River Clyde around Glasgow. And it'd been more than 100 years since there'd been any fish there, you know, and since the shipyards have all closed, the fish have come back. So that's kind of good news. I grew up in a town with more than 30% unemployment, so that's the downside of the shipyards closing. But in the Caribbean, I saw for the first time at night. I'm Tony, I'm Scottish, and I feel rather odd speaking at a thing like this today, but I've had rather a lot to do with the sea. And well, I know what I wanted to start with. It's not exactly an ad, but inside this CD